Well, how did I become a writer? I always wanted to be a writer. Even before I knew how to read, I knew reading was a thing. My mom read me books. I knew someone wrote those books. And I thought I could write books. And so I was very excited. I did learn to write. Um, and eventually, actually 50 years ago now, I got my first job. I was working as a journalist for a local newspaper. And then wrote for other publications and things. In the 1990s, I began writing science fiction. And also in well, I'd always had houseplants. And in the 1990s, one of my houseplants attacked and killed another one of my houseplants. And at first I thought, well, it was a vine and it grew around the other one and killed it. And I thought, well, I should have been paying more attention. That was my fault. And a month later, one of my plants tried to sink a root into another one of my plants. And I thought, well, that might be a pattern here. So I began to do some research and I discovered that plants are awful. They're horrible things. They attack each other. They fight in all sorts of different ways. Um, yeah, an early botanist said once, all plants in a given place are in a state of war with respect to each other. And we hear now there's a World Wide Web and they cooperate. That's also true to an extent. They cooperate with their friends. They try to kill their enemies. And usually those other plants. And the problem is that there is not enough sunlight. And they fight really hard for sunlight. So I learned all this and they fight for sunlight and they do that in all sorts of different ways. For example, a balsa wood tree grows really, really fast. You can actually sit there and watch that thing get taller. So they get way up to the top, but they do that by having really light wood. An oak tree has very dense wood, but it grows slowly. And so what it does, and other hardwoods like that, is as they grow up, branches move against each other in a forest, and they just cut their way to the top and chop the branches off of other trees. In some places, I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of kinds of plants, and everyone has their little niche. So I discovered that they do that. They use animals for a lot of things, as you know. They use to spread seeds. They use them by doing fruit. And here's where you say you want to communicate with plants. Well, they communicate with you. If you have a tomato, when it turns red, that plant has told you something, which is you should eat that tomato because the tomato seeds can go right through you, come out on the other end, and they're fertilized, and now they have fertilizer, and they're ready to grow. So tomatoes really want you to eat them. And so they tell you when you should do that because they know you will. They have us trained. Um, so there's flowers and bees fertilize flowers. Wheat, their sneaky thing is that they just grow so many seeds at once, we can't eat them all. And so some of them will make it to the next season and will grow. And there's a question, did we domesticate wheat or did wheat grow in such a way that we were so eager to grow it that we became dependent on wheat and became big wheat farmers? We do know that rye volunteered to be domesticated because it's a little smaller plant. It can sneak into a wheat field and grow there, and we can't pick it out. And then when we harvest that with the wheat, but the rye has a lot of seeds too. So rye also wants you to eat that. They've figured us out and they're using us. I learned that. I learned all sorts of things. This started in the 90s. I kept doing more research. I still follow the research. And now that there's better mechanisms that we can do all sorts of genome tracing and some very fancy chemistry, we're learning a lot more ways that plants do amazing things. But that was the point. Plants are not passive. Plants are at least assertive. They are aggressive. Every one of them is trying to do things. I've got a room full of plants here, and every one of them has their little plan about how they're going to conquer the world. So, all right, so I write science fiction, and I thought, well, if plants do that, we're not really sure how if they, well, define think. Do plants think? Depends. We know they can remember things. A tree will remember what the weather was like last year and assume that the weather's going to be like this year the same. So if it's dry, they'll do things to try to cope with what might be a drought. They plan ahead that way. Plants remember things. They do seem to make decisions. It's really hard because you can't run a plant through a maze like a rat and see what the rat can figure out. But they do seem to make decisions on which way they're going to grow, how they're going to handle different things. There's definitely differences between individuals. So if they could think like us, because they do seem to have some understanding of what's going on in the world, but if they could think like us, if they could plan ahead, then what would they do? Understanding that they have an enormous range of tools at their disposal of how to cope with the world. And that was how my idea for the novel started. How could I dramatize all of the super cool things that plants do? They cooperate, they fight, they manipulate other animals, they manipulate other plants. So pretty much everything that is in semiosis are things that plants can actually do and that they do on Earth. They just don't necessarily think 5 years ahead. And they don't make so many conscious decisions in the sense that we make conscious decisions, because I don't know what that plant there is doing. It is thinking, if it has a plan. That's a really big debate right now. So anyway, that was my thought. So the easiest way to do that, I figured out, was just to set up another planet where they have plants like that. And then we'll send Earth people there, and then things will get complicated fast. So that's basically how the novel started. And from there, it's just like any other science fiction idea. You have to dramatize everything that's going on. One of the reasons I skipped generations is that no matter what I did, and I tweaked that planet somewhat, plants are just slow. They're low energy things. I did some math once. I got some information so that if my skin were impregnated with photosynthetic material, if I could photosynthesize like a plant, and I spent all day just laying naked in the sun, I would make the caloric equivalent of 3 cocktail peanuts. Or was it 7? Anyway, just a few cocktail peanuts. And I need to eat like over 300 cocktail peanuts a day just to keep myself moving as a small woman. So plants are just low energy. They make their own food, but they can't make a lot. It's just, so that's why I skipped the generations so that the plants, especially Stevland there, could have a chance to understand what was going on and get ready to act when the opportunity came. But now, so I'm doing it generation by generation. That gives me the freedom and the obligation as a writer to start to use that in also ways to dramatize things. And that's basically how I wrote the book. I will say that initially, there's now 3 books in the series. Book 1 and book 2 were going to be the same book, and then I got like halfway through book 1 and said, oh no, this is going to be way too long. I got to end this book here. So I cut that idea in half.
Thank you, Sue. I have a couple questions, but I'll leave it to the round table. Melissa, Jen, Brian, if you want to start with a question, or do you want to throw it back to me because I got a couple.
I actually had one kind of related to that generations idea. So, obviously, yeah, I mean, it works really well with looking at the plant and how, like, obviously, yeah, you do need a lot of time for it to, yeah, make these decisions, to be able to grow, to be able to change in a way that works, for the story, for dramatic purposes, and to move the plot along. Um, I did think it was really interesting the how the pacing kind of ended up going between having the, I guess, the plant there, from the very beginning, going through all of the chapters, and it living such a minuscule amount of its own lifespan, but then the generations of all the humans and bouncing back and forth between these humans who were, they were living for a few chapters of the book. We'd go to the next chapter and they would go from, a very young character to, one of the oldest, on this planet now. Um, was that a pacing idea that you had, like, already had? Was that something that was just necessary because of how you wanted to, like, use the plant as like the bamboo as actually one of the main characters? Um, or did you just find that kind of like, it was just advantageous to use it?
Well, I knew I wanted to tell at least part of the story from the plant's point of view. One of the problems with that is that plants don't move. So I had to, people do move around. And so it couldn't just be all plant all the time. But as for how I picked the characters and moved them around, um, there was an overall arch of the story that I wanted to tell. And so I picked characters that would have the most dramatic things to add to each one of those chapters.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Sue. Jen, Melissa, do you have a question or want to pass?
You sort of already answered what I was going to ask you. I think Stevland's such an interesting character, and especially when we get to his perspective, he was certainly thinking and caring more about the humans than I expected him to at that point in the story. I was going to ask about the inspiration for Stevland and why you chose sentient plants, but you answered that already. So, but thank you.
Yeah, that's why, if I can, that's why sentient plants, but why that plant? And two things went into that. One is that we know that many plants are social beings. That is, that they do live in communities. They don't always fight, but they will, especially if you get into a forest, all the trees of the same species will tend to work together. In they exchange information, even with other plants. They exchange help with each other. If one of them gets sick, they might send it some food. They're social beings like us. So we know a lot about social beings because we know about us. And one of the things is that if a social being is alone, it's just very, very hard for them. Very hard for them emotionally, psychologically. In prison, solitary confinement is considered torture. It's just that hard. So we have Stevland, and he's all alone. He's the only one of his kind. And then some other creatures come along that he can relate to in a similar way. He now has the social life that he needs for his mental health. He's really got anxiety issues. He's got separation issues. That's why he sometimes does not react in a good way, because he's not acting. He's not a well plant. So these people come, and he needs them for his sanity. He may not understand this consciously, but unconsciously, yes, he's a social being, and now he has a social community, and he will protect that anyway. He has to. He will do anything to keep the humans there. Good, bad, indifferent. And so that's why he's that personality. But this is, we know this, again, from our own planet, and what we know about the creatures here is that that's what they're like. Also, there's a tree called Pando, and it's a quaking aspen, and it's, I think, in Utah, and it's like 40,000 years old, and it's huge because it just keeps up sending shoots here and there, so it looks like it's just one forest, but it's just one big honking tree. And that was also the basis of it. Panda was not the only one of its kind. It's not the only kind of plant that lives like that. There's some kelp forest that's just one big, huge kelp plant, but it covers quite a bit of a seafloor. And so that's also another thing. Stevland is big, but he's just one thing, and he's the only one of his kind. And so he has problems that the humans can solve for him.
And Stevland is bamboo, correct? That's
Well, I call it bamboo. Many sort of like earth bamboo. The reason I did that is that if you look, when Europeans came to America, they started naming things after stuff that they thought resembled the things back home. So here, what we call a robin and what in Britain they call a robin are two totally different birds, not even the same family. And there's other examples of where names were just stuck on things by, at least in English, by what the first English speaker came by and said, hey, that looks like one of them. So yeah, they call it bamboo. It's a lot like bamboo, but very different too. It's a different species, so, well, it's a different planet.
And you chose bamboo because bamboo is fast growing. And this is not me that thought of this, but actually, there's a woman named Rachel who wanted to be here tonight but couldn't. And I asked her, I said, why do you think Sue chose bamboo? And she said, oh, it grows fast. Were there any other reasons why you chose Stepland to be what these colonists called bamboo?
Yeah, it grows fast, it grows pretty, it grows Pando-like as it just sends out more shoots and grows and expands that way. They have bamboo. Bamboo grows in North America now. And the joke is, how do you get bamboo? If you have bamboo growing in your yard, how do you get rid of it? You move. It just expands forever.
Okay. Melissa, do you have a question or do you want to pass?
I do actually. I had a few in mind, and though two are competing because you kind of in this last string touched on one of them in the naming piece and the colonizer component, and definitely a question there about where else from human history you might have drawn inspiration from. But before that, I'd love to ask about the title of the novel itself. It suits beautifully when you go to look up the definition and kind of the word itself. But I think fair to say as a term, as a concept, is not everyday by any means. Most of us haven't encountered the word before. So curious to know what brought you to that concept, which then allowed you to really, again, drop it in beautifully for this narrative and the way it plays in. But how did you discover semiosis as a concept in your travels?
Well, the concept was in the book before we got to the point of putting on a title. That came really very late. And so I was with my editor and we were just going over lists of words that might apply to this. And semiosis was the perfect word because what I was getting at was communication among species, and sometimes very, very different species. And how do they do that? And so, but that was key, of course, to the novel, is that once they started talking to each other, they had things in common. So the word came late.
And see, that's the funny thing. I feel like when you're a reader looking in, you never know at which point. Was it one of the pieces that's there from the start of the journey, or does it show up in a case like this in a working session with the editor to find the perfect name for the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Sue. Sue, this is going back to your discussion on your research. I also read that you originally wrote a short story for a class that was the first chapter, correct? For that, then you expanded to this book and the second book. The research process, did you do all the research that you mentioned before, where you're learning about plants, learning about the way they behave, before you wrote that short story, and then applied all the research you had learned into the writing and then into the book? Or was it a process that you kept on researching while writing, like, oh, how can I make a plant like this, or how can I fit a plant to this real world activity? Can you elaborate on the research integration process?
Well, the class I think you're mentioning is it was a writer's workshop called Clarion, and we had an exercise where there's a war, two warring parties, and suddenly a certain kind of wall appears between them that has an effect on the war. And we wrote a story or briefs, at least a start from that. And that was the idea, was we had the two snow vines, and all of a sudden a human colony pops up between them, and they still want to fight each other, but now they have an obstacle between them. That idea I expanded later on to a short story, and that was published, I think, in the 1990s. And then later on, I decided that there was enough there that I could put it into the novel. So the first chapter was a short story, although it was somewhat rewritten, and that became the rest of the book. As for research, I was doing that all along, just because it's fun, also because I've got these plants and I want to know how to take care of them. And things were added, or I came to a point that said, I think I know there's some science about that, so I checked into it. Scientists are really easy to talk to if you pay. No one seems to care about what they do, or at least they feel that way. So if you come at them with an intelligent question, they're like, oh my God, someone's paying attention. And they will tell you more than you need to know, happily. So I started, when I had questions, I would do some research, or I knew something and knew I could add that as it went along. Now I need to say that I finished this book actually in 2004, and then a whole bunch of stuff happened. So that when I finally came to write Usurpation, plant science had developed a lot more. So there's some things in there that no one knew back when I wrote the book. And still things that we're finding every day, because scientists are hard at work because there's a lot we don't know.
I have a left field question that's very selfish, because it's something that I've started to research, but I haven't found a lot of material with it, and it's connected to plants and sci-fi. Have you ever, in the course of your research, have you looked at growing plants in space and how that would be done, like on an interstellar vessel, or in the International Space Station? Because when you type into Google, like, how do you grow plants in space, there's not that much there. Have you come across that in your research?
NASA is doing constant experiments with that, and discovering how do plants deal with the lack of gravity, and they respond differently to that. Can you really grow things? I mean, they have grown a couple flowers. They've grown some lettuce, which the astronauts ate and were really glad because they don't get fresh food up there. And so they're working on that all the time because that will be essential. But the question is, how do plants respond? Because it's a very different environment for them. And they're trying to learn what they can as fast as they can. For example, moss. Usually moss just, sort of grows sort of straight up. But it turns out that that's really dependent upon gravity. So you plant it there, it just sort of spreads out in circles because it has no idea which way to grow. Most plants respond to light because they're very sensitive to that, but not all of them. So they are working on that. And
Excellent.
would they grow in regolith, which is the the soil-like texture, the thing that we have on the moon? Would they grow in Mars soil? And those are interesting questions. Of course, who is it? Andy Weir, who I think
Potato.
was working for NASA at the time, wrote The Martian, and he checked into everything we know about growing potatoes on Mars. If you have not read the book, you will learn more about growing potatoes on Mars than you wanted to know. But yeah, it is a very, very good book, and I recommend that one too.
I like that book too. So we can go back around the table. I still have a couple questions, but I'll bring it back to Brian if you have a question you want to ask, or you can pass.
Let's see. Some of my other ones just got asked, so I will pass for now while I kind of rephrase some of my other ones.
Jen,
I'll pass.
Melissa, pass as well, because I got one in the holster. If
I was going to jump in and go back
All right,
to
let's hear
one
it.
of the other pieces from
Mhm.
earlier. Is there a thread to be pulled when it comes to colonizer, colonized stories, whether in fiction or drawing from real historical examples that influenced the novel in particular as you were writing?
I don't know of things in general, but being in the United States, I am very aware of how we did things here, and some of the mistakes, some of the assumptions that didn't necessarily work. And so that was a thought. I mean, and of course, the people, the imaginary people who I sent on this mission, they would have been aware of these same things too. They know human history and how we didn't necessarily do a good job of some of our colonization, and that's why they tried. We're going to try to live in harmony with the life that we find there, and that's one of the questions in this story too. Can they really do that? Their name is Pax, peace. Are they going to really have peace? Well, maybe not, or maybe so, but just in a different way. They're going to keep trying to do that every way they can. And I think in the end, they did manage to achieve their goals, but not in the way they wanted.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Sue.
I have a question for everyone here. There's a mistake in this book that other readers have asked me about, and then I went back and yeah, I made a mistake.
A typo or a idea?
No. There's a piece of information that I thought was in there when we were doing a final editing of the book, and we wanted to cut the words down a little bit for reasons. And so I took a passage out because I was pretty sure that it appeared in there twice, and it only needed to be in there once, but it was only in there once. And so there's a little explanation of what happened. I did put in the follow-up, made sure I put in the follow-up book right away in like chapter 1, but it's not in Semiosis.
I have a theory, but I could be wrong. And I in the questions that my notes that I sent you, this was in it. So the colonists are so capable. That's what I love about the characters in the beginning. They even though they struggle and there's conflict, like they're capable. And when they encountered the Glassmakers, they already knew that they were already writing with Stevland.
Mhm.
and I thought, why did they not use writing for to communicate with the Glassmakers because they knew their language, because they were struggling to communicate with them when they encountered them, and I thought, why don't they just use the writing? Is that the mistake, or is that just my own?
That's that's not a mistake I had in mind. They should have tried a little harder, although they did do some, and most of the people they met couldn't read. And I think what happened is that I knew that as the author, was that they're coming up against some people who couldn't read even if you tried. So telepathically, my characters came to know that it wouldn't be worth the effort too. And that happens sometimes, is that you know the story so well that you're telling that characters don't do things that they should do because you know it wouldn't work anyway. But they should have tried. That wasn't the mistake. Here's the mistake. Why did the Glassmakers leave the city? They left the city. There's like a couple paragraphs in there. Because they realized that they were failing. Their health was failing. They were not thriving in the city, and they thought they are naturally nomadic species. So they were just going to go back to a nomadic way of life, and that would restore their health, which didn't work. But that's why they left the city.
Okay. And why was their health failing in the city?
The same reason that it almost failed with the humans, is they just could not get the kind of food that they needed. And humans only survived because Stevland made sure that they got what they needed and worked out that. But he couldn't do that for the Glassmakers just because he wasn't that capable at that point. And so their health was failing, and they thought if they went around and ate more widely, that would solve the problem.
Okay. And at what point was this originally in there, but then taken out? That there's a realization of why the Glassmakers left?
I'm pretty sure that's in chapter 5.
Okay. I have a question that actually is connected to that. So Stevland's personality, and you applied different personalities to the different plants, especially near the end when there was the conflict between the Glassmakers and the humans. How did you decide the personalities and the like way of being of the different plants? Yeah, what was that creative process like? I remember the pineapples were the ones who were betrayed, right? It was the
Yeah,
pineapple.
it's like yeah, we won't do this. Well, if you don't do this, then and poor Stevland has to try to explain that to them. I try to think of it from the plant's point of view. What would a pineapple really want if pineapples, well, presumably they do want things, and if they could express that. If you tulips just aren't very smart. They had, and the snow vines also took a while for them to understand what to do. But what would be the logical thing for a plant in that situation to want to do? And again, knowing the variety of behaviors that we have among different kinds of species here on Earth. And I
Excellent.
should say the pronunciation of the name is Stevland.
Even.
And that was a question for a while, but because he's named after Stevie Wonder, whose real name is Stevie. And so how did he say that? And I finally found a piece from a TV show, and Diana Ross is talking to him and calls him Stevland. So that's how I know for sure that it's Stevland.
Okay.
Interesting.
Anyone want to jump in? I have another question. But if I'll leave it to the the table. If anyone wants to ask a question. So Sue, before everyone arrived, talked briefly about how you're a translator, and that's something that you continue to do. Um, how has your work as a translator informed your writing and your science fiction writing, either with the themes that you choose or just the process?
Well, in this book, there was the question of how do different species communicate with each other, the whole question of semiosis. And that was part of the languages between the humans and the glassmakers, humans and some of the other species. How do you move from language to language and from different forms of communication? Because how do they communicate with the bats and the moths and other creatures there? I should say that the glassmakers are based very vaguely on human or earthly ants. And how do ants communicate? Because they certainly do. And some of the chemicals that they're using for things are really based on the very same chemicals that ants use and the way that they use them to say, come here, danger, their identity within the nest. Because ants are very, very social creatures and they have a lot that they need to tell each other. So it was based on that. The sounds pretty much are red-winged blackbirds. And the language that they speak is very roughly based on the Mayan language, the Maya Indians, and how the grammar that they use in there. The language I translate from is Spanish into English, which isn't the most different languages on earth. But even from there, to take an idea from Spanish into English, sometimes means that you have to break it down and then put it back together. Some of what we say is very similar. Some of our ideas they just don't match, except that they mean the same thing. How do we say the way I would say something in Spanish and in English would be totally different.
How did you conceptualize the Glassmakers? Meaning, it sounds like you have this hodgepodge of Mayan ants. Did you know writing this book that you wanted them to be this barbaric type of people? Or at what point in the writing process did you start to think, okay, they need to be like this? Here's why. Yeah, can you dig into Glassmakers and how you made them and why you made them that way?
They sort of evolved as I was working through the plot and what would make a good drama. And some of it is real. What we know about ants is that they do fight a lot among themselves. If you're an ant, the biggest danger you have is from other ants. We don't really matter that much to them. And again, because they compete. And so how would that be if you had ants that are from multiple queens, or if there is no queen running them? And we know from I think E.O. Wilson knows more about ants than any other person, and he's explained how ants behave and what they would do. So that helped, and I could use it for some of that. The ants aren't savage, but they're just behaving like groups of people that are just naturally hostile to each other, the way that ants are. By the time you get to the next book, they're actually they behave very well. They add a lot to the community. they argue no more than humans argue against each other, and overcome some central problems that they have in some creative ways. But at that point, their social structure is breaking down, and they just have internal problems that cause all sorts of problems for everyone around them.
Excellent, thank you. I got another question, unless someone wants to jump in. This is a very sci-fi question. I think it was when we had Enlecki speak to us, we talked about world building and how that's, for some sci-fi authors, it's the hardest part. Other authors, like Adrian Tchaikovsky, it's the easiest part. Like for him, he loves world building, struggles with character and drama. Your world building process, did you come up with it as you write, or did you plan it all before? Because there were these brilliant lines like describing someone thin as a parasitized aspen, like, right, integrating into their language and their metaphors their environment. Did you like have a list of that outside of the story, or did you just write and try to imagine the characters and it came naturally? Can you just elaborate on your world building process?
Well, as for the metaphors and things like that, I think that came because I speak Spanish and I speak English. And so the way you might describe something in Spanish would relate to things that they would know in their culture. And the way you would do it in English would relate to other things that we would know in their culture. And sometimes when you translate that, that's a challenge. For example, we have in English, especially in American English, a lot of expressions that relate to baseball. In Spanish, they have expressions that relate to bullfighting. And so how would the idea that you would express your metaphors would reflect your culture, that just came naturally to me because I was living that every day, of hearing things and going, oh, that's interesting. I understand what they're saying because I live in Spain, but if I just translated word for word, no one would understand it in English. So that came from that way. When I do world building, I do a lot of research, probably over research. That's half the fun of it. But what I look for are problems. And when I was researching for the Semiosis novel, I already knew that plants need iron because I have plants and you have to get plant food with iron in it because that's what they use that makes it green in photosynthesis, and it's very chemically important to them. There's actually calorie for calorie more iron in broccoli than there is in beef. So plants need iron. And as I was doing my research, I discovered that you could make a planet. Ours has a lot of iron on the surface, and many planets do. But it's also possible for it to pretty much all get into the core of the planet and very little on the surface. Okay, well, so you have a planet, there's not a lot of iron. Plants need iron. I bleed red from iron. I would be a good way to get iron. In fact, there are a lot of carnivorous plants on our planet because plants need things that they can't get from their environment. So you have a planet where they need iron, and then these humans come, and like any other animal, we're very delicious and very nutritious, but you have a plant that desperately needs human social culture. On the other hand, it's hungry. And it's going to have to find a way to deal with all of that. And when I got to that point, I knew I had a novel because there was just enough problems in there, enough conflict from the environment that I could use that as a basis of making even more problems. So that's what I look for in world building is things that just cause trouble and cause conflict that don't work very well, and build from that.
Thank you, Sue. That's brilliant advice. So when you see your mind ricocheting and all the conflicts and potential problems, you go, all right, that's a novel material. Excellent. Anyone else have any questions? I have one. I think Brian.
Yeah, I've got another one. So I was wondering about, so obviously there are a lot of different types of conflicts happening throughout the story, especially when we're looking at the human POVs, and we see obviously the conflict of, they get to this planet, surviving itself is a huge struggle, especially at the beginning. But then as we go on, we see that there are conflicts between the generations, and you made it. I know the generations are very distinct, whereas I feel like in our lives now, like obviously, yeah, we have differences between our generations. We can see some gaps depending on people's ages, but it's a lot more of a blend, I think. Whereas in the book, each of the generations really tried to define themselves, and sometimes they didn't all agree with each other within the generation. But even later in the story, it was there are separations. This person's generation 6, this one's generation 7, and there are rules based on which generation you're in, who you're allowed to have like relationships with, and different types of interactions. And each one of them finding a physical way to kind of show their differences, like the face painting, or one of the groups was like dyeing their hair. Was there, I guess, anything specific that kind of pushed you towards making that like very strong distinction between the generations? Was that another way maybe to show the very, very fast development of the humans in comparison with the plants? Was it something else?
Yeah, I don't recall exactly what made me decide to do that, but what I do know is that different cultures have sometimes very different rules about who can do what is a family, who gets in, how you define the family, and identify the family. And I think it came from that, is that different cultures have some very different ideas about how this works. But if you started basically with all of the from one generation to another, where it could be easily defined, then how would they do that, and what would that mean for them? Because there would be taboos about where we have taboos that you can't have sex with your parents or with your immediate family. So I just built on that, and it was a fun idea, but I think not an unreasonable idea. I know that a lot of the ideas for interpersonal conflict, I worked as a journalist for a long time, and I've seen a lot of conflict and sat through some meetings where I'm surprised no one punched each other. And so that just gave me an idea of how people work together in conflict and in cooperation as well. That's the fun of being a journalist, is you get to see all sorts of kinds of people.
Was there a generation that you enjoyed writing about the most in this book? If you can remember the process of jumping that came the easiest, that you just liked exploring the most, or where each generation have its own, I guess, feel and.
Again, I tried to work out characters that would fit into the plot in the most dramatic way, and would emphasize things. I do have to say that poor Higgins I still can't read that chapter without crying because I did such horrible, mean things to him. And I apologize, but I think it made a good story of him changing as his experiences changed as well. But I killed his baby.
So it sounds like the generational tech style, you want to find conflict in the best way possible, and plants have longer lifespans than humans, so that worked out well with that. But also, I'm curious to know if this was a conscious motivation, which I assumed was the motivation when I first started reading it, which is you could show the brutality and the transience of a colonization effort so real with that generation jumping, because as a reader it was a jolt. Like you read and then you start to feel these characters, and then you're just ripped into the next generation. And that's how it is on that to me. I thought, wow, that's how it would be on a planet that was colonized. Did you that jolting, did you want that feeling, or was that not a motivation?
Yeah, I wanted every story to be distinct. Also, different generations basically betrayed the next one coming. The expectations of the original settlers was they were going to create pretty much paradise. And then their kids are going, well, but I'm hungry and I don't get to read any books and I have to work really hard. And this isn't what they think it is. And some of that was based also on cults and children of people who found cults, and then their children don't like the cult that their parents created, and there's conflict with that.
Excellent. I have one more question, unless other people want to jump in. So other people in this group who couldn't make it today, they like to watch the recording, or I think they do. They say they do, and I know some of them are writers. Can you elaborate on your writing process, because that's often interesting to people? Meaning, are you a planner? Are you a spontaneous writer? Because we had Ann Leckie last time, and she said that she really leaves a lot open because she likes to see naturally where the story goes. Can you share with us your process?
Sure. I plan as much as I can. Some of that came because I'm a journalist. And you do all of your research for an article, and then you'd have to sit down and write the article, and you'd have to do all that in a day, because you have a deadline. So I got used to that kind of process of finding out as much as you can, and then trying to write it in the most effective and interesting way that you can. So I do a lot of research, but in the case of this book, I knew a lot was going on, but for each chapter, I had basically just one sentence, is that, okay, so the humans find out that the Glassmakers are still alive, and they go to meet them, and it turns out badly. That was my whole plan for that chapter. Next chapter, the Glassmakers come to the city. It works out very, very badly. And so as I was going through that, I would start in earlier chapters to figure out, well, what could go seriously wrong in chapter 5, and start to plant things for that, that would lead to it.
Plant things.
So yes. There's one of the ways you can do it is there's architects, which are the plotters, and pantsers, which are gardeners, and I do some of each, just because writing a novel is really, really complicated, and no matter how much you know, unless you write 100-page outline for a 400-page novel, you're going to have to work things out as they go along. There are people who actually do that, particularly for mystery writers, because all that has to fit so closely together. Then they will do that. I'm not quite capable of that, but I try to plan as much as I can, and collect as much ideas as I can that I can start to use them later on. For example, there's these floating cactuses. Why are they the color that they are? Well, they're the color that fish are. That if you're a fish and there's something you want to be in different colors so your predators can't see you in different places, and that's everything that went into that. But I had that idea that when I wanted to like make floating cactuses, that's why that they could be colored that way for a reason.
Thank you. Well, Sue, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for participating in this conversation. Something new I'd like to do. The reason how we discovered you is because another author recommended you. Are there any sci-fi books that you've read recently by a living author that you'd like to shout out? And then I can propose it to the group, the Instagram group, to say, hey, does anyone want to read this book? Or maybe you do you, I should first ask, do you read contemporary sci-fi that?
I read, yeah, as much as I can. Let's see, one that's quite different from me, but that, oh, I cried like a baby at the end, is Meet Me in Another Life. And that's by Urana Sylvie, I want to say. But yeah, it's you start reading that, you don't think it's science fiction, and then at the end it is, and then she does this thing. So yeah, it's definitely Meet Me in Another Life.
Yes, Catriona Sylvie, you're right. You got it.
Yeah. So that was one book that I really, really enjoyed a lot. Another book about language is Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, and that's by, I think, R.L. Kwang. And that was recommended to me by other translators who don't necessarily read science fiction, but they read this thing and said, oh my God, this is such a good translation book. So that looks at the process of translation, from how it actually works or could work in, again, what can plants do? Well, what could translation do if you're going to use it as a basis of a novel?
Thank you. All right, everyone. Brian, have a good day. Jen, Melissa, Sue, have a good afternoon, night. I'll edit this and put tabs on different topics of the conversation, and I'll share it with the readers, and I'll send it to you, Sue. So thank you so
Okay.
much. And I mentioned this in email too, that I'll propose to the readers too if they want to read number 2 and 3 for the series, and so maybe we'll see you again.
All right, I'd be glad to come.
Thank you,
Tell
Sue.
you what I've fixed for the last book. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.